today we'll continue with contemporary theories of motivation. In the previous lectures, we have discussed the early theories of motivation. After that, we have discussed maybe one or two of the contemporary theories of motivation. Today, we'll continue with those theory. Last thing I think we discussed was the goal-setting theory. Today we are going to discuss more theories. One of those is self-efficacy theory. Now, when you talk about self-efficacy theory, it is also related, or it is called also social cognitive theory. Also, it is known as social reinforcement theory. And maybe earlier in the previous lectures, we have discussed issues related to reinforcement and types of reinforcement and so on. Okay, now when you talk about self-efficacy, it is related to individuals up to what extent they believe that they are capable of doing their work. So here we are talking about some sort of self-confidence of individuals related to their capability to perform different tasks related to work assignments. Okay, so if the individuals believe that they have high ability to perform different tasks, here we can say that they have high self-efficacy. If it is the opposite, then we can say here that individuals have low self-efficacy. Even the terminology self-efficacy, I think we have discussed this earlier in attitudes, but today we are discussing it as using motivational perspective. But earlier we have discussed different attitudes related to work, and one of those was self-efficacy. Again, self-efficacy, it is related to a certain belief, and when we talk about beliefs, we are talking about attitudes somehow, okay, that an individual has about his or her capability of performing different tasks. Now, the most important features when we talk about self-efficacy, first of all, of course, as it is obvious, we are talking here about a high level of confidence or a greater confidence. Those employees who believe more that they are capable of performing their tasks, of course, their self-confidence here, we are talking about high self-confidence. At the same time, usually such individuals exert more resistance. I mean here, of course, efforts taken by those individuals to accomplish different tasks. They do not give up easily. They try more and more in order to achieve results or to achieve different goals and objectives. Also, usually such individuals are good or they have better response here when we talk about negative feedback. What we mean here by negative feedback, that if someone, for example, the supervisor informed the individual that he is late, or for example, more effort must be exerted in order to accomplish work, or so on, usually such individuals, they are going to give more effort in order to accomplish the assignments, for example, on time, according to quality standards given by the organization, and so on. Okay. Now, what we need to do here is to identify the relation between self-efficacy and goal-setting theory, which we have discussed earlier. Of course, researchers, they consider that self-efficacy theory is complementary to goal-setting theory. Why self-efficacy theory is considered as a complementary theory to goal-setting theory? Last theory we have discussed was goal-setting theory. Now, again, researchers consider that self-efficacy theory is a complementary theory to goal-setting theory. Why is that? Why individuals believe about their ability to perform different tasks, their high-level confidence, high resistance, taking negative feedback as a motivation to accomplish the assignment is considered as a complementary to the goal-setting theory. Yes?
Maybe because it's some kind of facilitating the goal achievement, which was proposed by the goal-setting theory. I mean, when we set a goal and start working on it, and we
Okay, so we are talking here about characteristics which is going to motivate individuals more to go after achieving their goals and objectives. In goal setting theory, we have discussed about how employees are trying to achieve different goals and objectives. Here we are talking about some personal quality characteristics which should energize more the individuals to go after or to try to achieve different goals and objectives. That's why it is considered, the founder of this theory is known as, his name is Bandura. Now Bandura, he is the one who said that individuals who believe more about their capabilities are more successful individuals. Discussing this issue from another angle or from another point of view. Now, when you talk about goal setting theory, we are talking about achieving goals and objectives. So those individuals who believe that they are capable of performing different tasks, they are capable also of achieving goals, objectives, and so on. That's why most researchers at this field, they consider that the self-efficacy theory is a complementary theory to goal-setting theory. Why? Because individuals who are having such characteristics are more able to succeed in achieving goals and objectives. Now, usually there are different also issues here, we can say, or factors which should help in increasing Okay. Those factors, as I have mentioned, it is expected to increase self-efficacy. Now, one of those factors is inactive mastery. Now, when we talk about inactive mastery, here we are talking about individuals and their effort to gain related experience. Now, some employees, they try to acquire or gain experiences related to work. Now, such employees usually they have a higher self-efficacy. Why? Because they try always to gain relevant experience which should help them in performing different tasks and assignments. So those employees with inactive mastery, or those employees who try always on a continuous basis to gain relevant experiences related to work assignments, usually such employees are expected to have high self-efficacy. Another factor here is vicarious modeling. Now, when you talk about vicarious modeling, here we are talking about learning from others, seeing someone who performed the task, learn from the ways or the methodology or approaches, mechanisms. Simply here we are talking about some sort of learning process by watching others performing similar tasks and assignments and learn from the situation. So this we call vicarious modeling. Now the third one here is verbal persuasion. Now, when we talk about verbal persuasion, we are talking here again about confidence. Now, in a way that sometimes people are more convinced to perform a task, or sometimes people are convinced by others to perform the task. Here we are talking about somehow we are talking about level of belief, okay, which is caused by high convince that this task is important. Now, when we talk about level of convince, sometimes others are convincing the individuals that this is important and it must be performed and results must be achieved and so on. Or sometimes maybe there is some sort of inner status here that this is important, and the employee here is convinced that this task should be accomplished at the end. Now, the fourth factor here is arousal. Now, when you talk about arousal, here we are talking about some sort of inner energy. We are talking here about internal motivation of individuals. Exactly, we are talking about something inside the employees, or it is related to the employees themselves. Here we are talking about self-motivation. Now, if the employee, him or herself, have this inner energy, usually such employees are going to have a higher self-efficacy. So again, Self-efficacy, it is considered as a complementary theory to goal-setting theory. Why? Because in goal-setting theory, we are talking about achieving goals. Here we are talking about up to what extent individuals have belief about their ability to achieve different tasks and assignments. So usually individuals with high self-efficacy are more successful individuals in achieving their goals and objectives. Now, when you talk about self-efficacy, usually there are some characteristics here. Such people, they have high self-confidence. This is one of the most important points. Their resistance is great. And the third point, that whenever they receive negative feedback, usually this is a motivation for them. So instead of losing focus, they focus more on correcting the situation and achieve different goals and objectives. Now, what should work to increase self-efficacy? Here we are talking about 4 important elements or factors. One of those is inactive mastery. Inactive mastery, it means here we are talking about up to what extent employees they gain experiences related to the task. The second one is vicarious modeling. Here we are talking about learning from others by watching others performing similar tasks. The third one, verbal persuasion. Here we are talking about up to what extent employees are convinced that this assignment or task is important. Usually sometimes the supervisor might convince them, other employees. Sometimes it might be even an internal issue. The fourth one is arousal. Here we are talking about inner state, up to what extent employees are self-energized to accomplish the task or assignment. Now, again, one of the most important points here, that self-efficacy is considered as support or complementary theory to goal-setting theory. And we have discussed why. Now, another theory here, and still we are talking about contemporary theories of motivation, is reinforcement theory. We have studied reinforcement earlier. Here we are going to discuss the issue from a different aspects. We are not going to discuss what are the types of reinforcements and so on. But reinforcement, the bottom line here, when we talk about reinforcement theory, we are talking about behavior being a function of its consequences. Okay. Earlier we said that usually people believe according to what they expect as a reward for their doings, and here it is the same meaning. We are talking about behavior being a consequence of its a function of its consequences. Okay. Now, when you talk about reinforcement theory is when we have discussed self-efficacy, we said that it is complementary to goal-setting theory. Now, when we talk about reinforcement theory, we are talking about counterpart theory. We are talking about something different here, or it might be, it's not only different, it is opposite in approach. Because in goal setting, we are talking about achieving goals. Now, when you talk about reinforcement, we are talking about maybe rewards, whether it is negative or positive, whatever is the type of rewards related to the work itself. So here we are talking about a counterpoint to goal-setting theory. We are not talking about something complementary. We are talking about something different here, discussing the issue from different perspective, totally different perspective. Now, why it is considered different? Because when you talk about goal reinforcement theory, we are talking about behavioralistic approach. The approach totally here, it is different, comparing it, of course, to goal-setting theory. Now, one of the most important elements related to reinforcement theory, and maybe it is at the same time one of the most important weaknesses, okay, that according to reinforcement theory, environment is the cause of behavior. Okay, and this means what? This means that there is total negligence here for thoughts or inner state of individuals. When you talk about reinforcement theory, what is taken into consideration here, different environmental factors, and what is the response to the behavior in terms of rewards, whether it is positive or negative, and so on. But inner thoughts or inner state of mind and so on, it is totally neglected. Like if individuals have no role here, they are only doing the thing, and all it is depending on what are the environmental factors influencing the situation. So this is how the reinforcement theory is discussing the issue, and this is considered as one of the weaknesses because we cannot neglect or ignore thoughts or inner state of mind and so on. Okay. Now again, we said that according to reinforcement theory, behavior is controlled by its consequences. You remember positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, extension, punishment, and so on. So according to the reinforcement theory, behavior is controlled by its consequences. And as I have mentioned, it is not a motivational theory. Here we are talking about behavioristic approach. The approach is related to explaining behavior rather motivating employees. So this is also one of the theories. When we say here that it is not a motivational theory, I do not mean here that it does not explain how motivation occurs. No, but what I mean here, how this theory was developed at the beginning, it was developed in order to explain behavior rather than explaining motivational process. Now when we talk about goal setting theory, we are talking about motivational process. When we talk about the self-efficacy theory, we are talking about motivational process. But when we talk about reinforcement theory, it is related to motivation, but this theory was developed in order to explain behavior rather explaining the motivation process itself. Okay. Another theory to discuss is equity theory. What is equity? What is equity? Okay, being treated at fair basis or equal to others, and not necessarily equal to others, sorry, but fairly comparing to others. Okay, here we are talking about equity. Okay, now based on this simple concept, there is a theory which is known as equity theory. Now when you talk about equity theory, usually according to this theory, employees, they compare the ratio of self outcome income to others outcome income. Okay, in other words, employees here they compare what they are giving to the organization and what the organization is giving to them, the ratio between those two, and they compare it to others, what they are giving to the organization and what the organization is giving to them. Now, according to this analysis here, we can say, usually employees, they are going to reach a conclusion, either that they are treated fairly or unfairly. Okay. Now, when you talk about this comparison, we do not mean here that the result should be that I am treated equally to others. Here we are talking about ratio analysis. Sometimes maybe others are taking more than me, and I am going to consider that I am treated fairly. Why? Because maybe I am giving less than them. Okay, and the same, maybe I'm going to take more and I'm going to find out that I am treated unfairly. Why? Because I should take more than that, also comparing this to the others' situation. So here we are not talking about equal situation, we are talking about ratio analysis, and according to that, the individuals, they are going to reach a result whether they are treated fairly or unfairly. Now this is the equity theory. It is some sort of comparison to the ratio of self-outcome input to others' outcome input, and according to that, usually the individuals, they are going to reach a conclusion whether they are treated fairly or unfairly. Now, usually if we are treated fairly, then we are talking here about an ideal situation where everything is good and there is no tension, and I do not have as an individual to do anything here, only I need to maintain the situation. Now, if I am treated unfairly or inequity, here usually individuals, they are going to feel tension, and if they feel tension, we are going to try to remove this tension. So we need to deal with the situation in order to resolve the situation. So when the ratio again are equal, of course, again, we do not talk here about equality, we are talking about equity. Okay. Now, when you talk about equity, here we are talking about that the ratio analysis or the result here is acceptable for the individual. There is no tension. Now, if it is unequal, then here we are talking about tension, and usually individuals, they are going to try to remove the tension. So the first state here we are talking about equity. The second state here we are talking about maybe the individuals are under reward or over rewarded, as I have mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, what is the equation here used? This is what is used usually. Here we are talking about outcomes of self, the ratio between outcomes, inputs, self, to outcomes, inputs of others. And we are talking here about a comparison. Again, we are not talking about equal state. We are talking about fair state. Now, fair state, maybe this is going to be more, and we are talking about fairness. Maybe it is going to be less, and we are talking about fairness. This is related to the comparison itself, okay? Because again, we are talking about here a ratio between outcomes and inputs. Okay. Now, with whom individuals are going to compare themselves? Okay. Can we compare ourselves with others from other organizations? And maybe from different levels. Okay. Now, okay, this is a tricky situation, but if I am talking about a traditional organization where all employees are treated according to salary, if I am talking about the university, for example, it is a traditional organization. Okay. Now, all professors, they are treated according to the same basis. So the comparison here is not valid. Okay, why? Because it is a matter only of tenure or years of experience. This is going to judge the differences in salaries. Again, I'm talking about traditional organization where there is no incentives and so on. Okay, so comparing myself to people at the academic field is useless. If I'm going to apply this, I'm going to compare myself to others from administrative staff or support staff and so on, okay, in order to find out the ratio between the two ends of the equation. Now, if I'm talking about modern organization, where there is some sort of performance appraisal system, and there is an incentive system and so on, rewards and so on, and if payment is related to performance, then at this situation I can compare myself to other employees from the same level. Why? Because we are not going to be paid the same. We are going to be paid according to the performance level. Okay, so usually employees in regular situations, they compare themselves to, even if we are talking about inside the organization, to other employees from other levels, other jobs, and so on. Unless we are talking about a modern organization where the salaries are paid performance-based and so on. So here we can do comparison with others from the same job title or from the same position. Now, when you talk, what are the referent comparisons here? We have different alternatives here. Either self-inside, self-outside, and I can compare myself to other employees inside the organization, or I can compare myself to other employees outside the organization. Sometimes employees, they are not going to compare themselves, they are going to compare others to others inside, or compare others to others outside. Okay, so either I'm going to compare myself with other employees within the same organization or outside the organization, or I'm going to compare some colleagues to employees inside the organization or outside the organization. When you talk about equity and fairness, here we are talking about something which is self-related, but also it is some sort of general perception. If the employees feel that there is equity in the organization, they are going to behave in a certain way. If they feel that there is inequity, they are going to behave in a different way, even if they are not the comparison part here. يعني if they are not part of the comparison, here we are talking about general status in the organization itself. Okay. Let us continue. Now, as I said earlier, if the employees perceive that they are treated fairly, usually they are going to maintain the situation. Now, if they reach a conclusion that they are treated unfairly, they are going to change the situation. Now, why employees need to change the situation? Why, if they are treated unfairly, or if they reach a conclusion that there is inequity inside the organization, they are going to change the situation? Yes? Okay, I said earlier that if there is equity, usually it is some sort of normal situation. If there is inequity, we are talking about tension, and we need to reduce the tension. Now, why we need to reduce the tension? Because if there is tension, maybe the turnover rate is going to increase. We are talking about absenteeism. We are talking about even performance. Now, in this point, maybe the performance is going to be lower and so on. So we need to remove the tension in order to overcome problems like turnover, absenteeism, control performance better, and so on. Okay. Now, how usually employees are motivated to deal with inequity? They have different scenarios. Okay, or we can say that there are different alternatives. One of those alternatives is to change the inputs. Now, when you talk about change the inputs, we need to go back to the equation itself. We said that we do here output, input analysis, so we can rethink the input. Okay, or we can rethink the outcome. Okay, now input, outcome, we are talking about our input, our outcome, or others' input or outcome. Here we are talking about some sort of calculations. Those calculations are done intellectually by individuals. We are not talking about a systematic approach using mathematical tools and papers and pencils and calculators. We are talking about something which is done by employees. It is a total intellectual process here. Okay, so maybe I'm going to rethink the input or rethink the outcome. Now, there are other alternatives, okay, like change perception of self or change perception of others. Okay, now when you talk about perception of self or perception of others, here we are talking about something which is related to assessment or evaluation or personal characteristics and issues related to myself, or sometimes it might be related to others. Now, another two solutions here, okay, maybe we are going to change the comparison itself. So instead of comparing myself to X, I'm going to compare myself to Y. Instead of comparing myself to someone from inside the organization, maybe I'm going to compare myself to someone from outside the organization. Okay, so here we are talking about changing the other party of the comparison equation itself. Now, the sixth alternative here, and maybe the worst one, is to leave the situation. When you talk about leaving the situation, we are talking here about giving up, not trying to change, but this is going to affect what? Negatively, of course. Performance. It is going to affect the performance, because at such situations, usually individuals are frustrated, they are not going to exert more effort, and usually their performance level at such situations is lower, and maybe it is going to develop to a certain situation where such employees, they are going to find another job or find another organization and so on. So here we are talking about some radical solution taken by the individuals, but its impact on the organization, for sure, it is negative. It's not in favor of the organization. Okay. Enough for today. طيب.